Hello, one and all. I am happy after the critical hour has gone the way of the dodo bird. I'm happy to be back associating and hanging out with my good friend, Mark Sleboda. Let's talk. Hello, one and all, and I am here with international security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, welcome to my humble YouTube channel.
Garland, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on your show. And may I say that it's great to talk to you again after I went almost a 2 week hiatus. And it is kind of like the old gang just never quit. Like the Sputnik radio hosts are not getting paid anymore, but they're still doing the same thing. I've had now interviews with you, two or three interviews with Rachel Blevins, who's got her own show, a couple interviews with Jamarl Thomas from Fault Lines on his own show, an interview with Ted Rall and Manila, who have got their own TMI show now, previously the Final Countdown. So it's almost like you people really believed in what you were saying and doing and talking.
Well, let me tell you, and the conversation hasn't changed. Of course, around here, let's see, we got Donald Trump cooking French fries and riding around in a garbage truck. We got Kamala babbling incoherently as always. My God, we do know she came up in a middle class family, and they were proud of their lawns. Other than that, ain't not a whole lot there. But at any rate, at least we have some people in your part of the world that have a few brain cells between their ears. So let's talk about that. Let's get started with Georgia. Georgia on my mind, as Ray Charles said, going back to Georgia. I think that was
Georgia, sweet Georgia. No,
yeah,
not
the
that
Queen of
Georgia.
Soul. A lot of songs been made about Georgia. Unfortunately for the neocons, the tune Georgia ain't singing the tune that they wanted to hear.
Yeah. So Georgia, for those of you who might confuse it with the U.S. state, is a small country in the South Caucasus, which is the area south of Russia between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. It's a very hilly, mountainous area. Georgia is renowned historically for its wine. It may very well be the first wine producing culture in the world, and its food, which, as anyone who's been to Russia knows, when real Russians celebrate, they eat Georgian food because it's much better than Russian food as a rule. So food and wine really something to miss. It's a small country, around 9 million population. There's actually a very large diaspora in Russia. More than 100,000 Georgians live there. It's had a troubled past since independence. They fell briefly into ethno-nationalist politics under the slogan "Georgia for Georgians," and there were already restive regions south of Ossetia, Abkhazia, and a few others that really didn't like the sound of the nationalist politics that followed the self-dissolution of the Soviet Union. There was some small wars. Eventually, Russian peacekeepers, a deal was reached. Russian peacekeepers were placed. And at some point in the early 2000s, there was the Rose Revolution, which was one of the first color revolutions where the U.S. helped install the neoliberal strongman Mikhail Saakashvili of "I eat my tie when I'm scared" fame. Now, he started a brief war with Russia by trying to reintegrate South Ossetia by force. and attacking Russian peacekeepers in the process. Russia defeated him in it was a less than a week war in 2008. And soon after that, he was replaced internally by a rise of, shall we say, pragmatic Georgian politics. A new Georgian political party arrived on the scene called Georgia Dream. And this, said, we may not like Russia, but we're kind of have to recognize geography. We're stuck where we are. It's a great power, and countries, whether it's Mexico dealing with the U.S. or Georgia dealing with Russia, small states have to make certain accommodations when they live next to great powers, both economically and militarily for security reasons. So they still were charted on a entry into the EU and into NATO, ostensibly course, but they were less confrontational about it. While diplomatic relations have not been restored with Russia since 2008, economic relations, which, money speaks, were opened. And Georgian wine and food and Borjomi sparkling water once again found a market in Russia, which vastly helped the Georgian economy. Now, the Georgia Dream Party has more or less been in power since, and there's been a period of stability and relative economic good times, right? Maybe, not always the most equal of economic distribution, but that's the same in any capitalist country. But Georgia's charting, like last year, 5%, 5 point something percent growth, right? Georgians started to have positive views again. But there is still a very significant, rabidly pro-Western, anti-Russian opposition. It's scattered among 4 different parties, right? None of which got really more than 10% in the recent election. But they're very loud, they're very vocal, and they tried to frame the recent parliamentary election last week, as on Georgia's geopolitical orientation. We have to choose. We're either with the West or we're occupied by Russia, right? That's the way they tried to frame it. And the kind of the loudest, at least the figurehead of the opposition, is the Georgian president. Now, Georgia is a parliamentary country, which means the real power is in the parliament. The president is kind of a symbolic office. But a few years ago, I really honestly don't understand how she got elected, Salome Zurabichvili. She was previously a French citizen, and she changed her citizenship to enter Georgian politics and run for president. Not only is she was she a French citizen, she was actually literally the French ambassador to Georgia. Talk about state capture. So she has been, rabidly screaming about the democratic course. And the Georgian Dream government, just before the elections this last weekend, they have passed 2 pieces of legislation that really teed the West off. One of them is a Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is just really like the American version or the Canadian version or the French version, which were actually, the Canadian and French were just passed at the same time Georgia was passing theirs. And it simply says that NGOs and media outlets funded by foreigners, they have to label themselves as such, right? They have to label that this is lobbying, effectively by a foreign government. The U.S. does not like that, right? They have their own Foreign Agent Registration Act, and they have no problems. In fact, they just outright ban Russian media, for instance. But it's a do as we say, not as we do. The deal is every non-Western country has to make themselves and their people completely vulnerable to influence by way of money and NGOs and stuff to the West, while the West is allowed to cut off all outside information coming to their own people. Those are the rules of the game. It's the rules-based order. We make the rules, we give the orders. And the other one was a LGBTQ, quote unquote, anti-propaganda measure, which is, even more hated in the West, very popular in Orthodox Georgia, that simply says that, okay, gay clubs, who cares what you do in your own house? That's not our business, but you're not allowed to promote a political ideology, LGBTQ, where children are around, right? That's very similar to Russian legislation on the subject. Well, those two drove the ire of the West, and right away there were sanctions tossed at the Georgian government, at the prime minister. There were threats. The EU accession process was effectively stopped. Everything came to a close, and it led Mark Miller, the U.S. State Department, to make threats, open threats to Georgia, saying you must resume your Euro-Atlantic course or there will be consequences, right? Said it right out like that. So the election, the results of the parliamentary election over last weekend saw the Georgia Dream reelected with a solid majority, 54%, and none of the four pro-Western opposition parties got much more than 10%, right, across the board. But right away, the pro-Western opposition has refused to recognize the results. They say there has been Russian interference in the election, right? Because Russians interfere in everything. And, when asked, what evidence do you have of this? The Georgian president, Salome Zurabishvili, said, well, we don't have any evidence. That's hard to find. The Americans claimed that the Russians were interfering in their elections, and they didn't present any evidence. So we don't have to either. What's important is we believe that there was interference. That's literally what she said, literally. So that's where it is right now. Several European governments, including Germany, have refused to recognize the results because the results weren't what they wanted, right? They're depicting this as a win for Russia. And again, the Georgia Dream Party is not pro-Russian. They're just not rabidly anti-Russian. And that's kind of the standard for the West now. All of its partners have to be rabidly anti-Russian. If you just want neutral, good relations with the West and Russia, that's not acceptable. You have to make a choice. So they've been obviously Viktor Orban, the Betnois Hungarian prime minister, who has really teed off Brussels and Washington. He made a special trip to Tbilisi right after the election. He congratulated the Georgian prime minister on his re-election, and he said outright, the West is trying to another color revolution in Georgia. Said it out just like that. He's going to end up shot. I mean, seriously, he's going to end up like Fizzo. This further infuriated the West. But right now, there's not a lot of sign that they're gaining a lot of, there's not the Maidan energy. Supposedly, right. Several hundred Ukrainians, some people off of the Maidan, some people involved in the Odessa massacre, some snipers, according to some reports, have appeared. But there isn't the mass crowds. They haven't been able to generate the huge crowds and the street muscle with the, Banderite, far-right, nascent militias that, were the strong arm of the Maidan in Ukraine in 2014. They don't appear to have the same strength in numbers or the same kind of street far-right muscle that helped them seize power in the country. It's not a done deal yet, but right now it does not seem that they're generating that critical mass on the streets that would be necessary to overthrow the government.
Yeah, it sounds like the regime change move is not what it used to be. All right, let's get back to something that's critical that really, I mean, this is an issue. I understand that there are virtually no troops that Russia's using anymore. They have all been replaced by North Korean troops. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Russian troops have completely withdrawn from Kursk and Ukraine and everywhere. And now there's only North Korean troops. I don't know, maybe all the Russian troops ran away, they quit, and just it's all North Korea now. Russia, in fact, as a state, I understand, may be completely replaced by North Korea, Mark.
It's literally Red Dawn 3. Wolverines,
Yeah.
right? I mean, this is the type of atmosphere that's being projected in the Western media, coming directly from the Kiev regime propaganda. There's claims of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, billions of North Korean troops. Only they're not just troops, actually. They know they're all North Korean special forces, right? You know, the guys that break cinder blocks with their heads, right? And eat capitalist livers for breakfast. I mean, that's you know, the type of forces that Russia is unleashing on Ukraine, according to the Western media. There's zero proof of this whatsoever. There's zero satellite photos. There's zero anything. I'm going to have to say that this story is 100% a hoax. I could be wrong, but it's there's no evidence to back this up. Now, I have no doubt that there are a certain number of North Korean troops in Russia. I don't know how many, a few hundred, maybe it's 1,500, 10,000 seems a little large. I have no doubt they are engaged in training and interoperability military exercises with Russia. They just signed a new strategic partnership with a mutual defense clause. They are literally treaty allies now, right? So they're allowed to do that on Russian territory. You know, we've heard several Western officials with no evidence say that North Korean troops are in Russia on the way to Kursk, right? The area where the dwindling Kiev regime's incursion into that strategic backwater of the border is. But they provide no evidence of this. And I actually seriously doubt that there's many North Korean troops there. Almost certainly, if they're anywhere, it's probably in the Far East. There is the possibility that some North Korean officers, specialists are behind the lines, logisticians, combat engineers, drone specialists, learning from what Russia is doing, right? Because this is a big deal. This is the first conflict, right? Near peer, you know, adversaries that the world has seen really on this scale since World War II. And it's, you know, let's be honest, it's Russia versus NATO. And, you know, the U.S. likes to call these conflicts that, you know, Russia is a near peer competitor. Well, I mean, okay, all right, let's be equally dismissive. Let's not refer to NATO as a peer competitor. Considering the results on the battlefield, the way that things have been going, we should say that NATO forces are a near peer competitor to Russia, right? You know, they're close, but they're not cutting the mustard. So I have no idea. I have no doubt that North Koreans want to learn from this, right? Particularly if they have provided some weapons, some artillery shells, maybe even some ballistic missiles, as the Western media claims. Russian and North Korean governments, for what it's worth, deny it. But if they have, well, then they probably want to see how they're being used, how they work in actual combat conditions. And this is almost certainly what is being blown up by the Kiev regime and now kind of belatedly picked up by Washington, by the Pentagon, by NATO Secretary General, you know, who are like, well, if these troops move to Kursk, you know, that would be blah, blah, blah. Well, first of all, if they did, let's assume for 1 minute that they're really there and Russia is really going to send them to Kursk inside Russia to fight the Ukrainians. That's inside Russian territory. That's actually completely internationally legal. There's a treaty between them. Now, I don't think that's the case. I don't think they're going to be engaged. There's a number of reasons for that. One, Russia and North Korea have not been doing military exercises since well before the fall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? They have zero military interoperability. That's why they need to begin training. That's why Russia and China have been doing a new military exercise practically every month for years now to gain that. That's what NATO does all the time, particularly considering the language barrier. All right, Russians don't speak North Korean, and most North Koreans don't speak Russian, right? So to send them into this extremely complicated battlefield with no common language, with no interoperability experience working together, these North Korean troops have never seen real battle before, right? As much like many troops around the world, right. But that would be very hard. And Russia doesn't need the manpower. Even the Western governments have admitted that Russia is enlisting some 30,000 volunteer contract soldiers a month, right? 1,000 a day, right? The Russian military, we've heard it from Cavaioli, the U.S. commander, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, Europe and NATO, say that the Russian army actually, as a result of this conflict, is getting bigger and better and more experienced and stronger. And that includes manpower, right? Russia is not sending press gangs to forcibly conscript people out of gyms and nightclubs and shopping malls like the Kiev regime is. They don't need 3,000, 10,000 North Koreans. They don't. And the diplomatic damage that would be done by dragging, making this conflict more international. Russia's too smart diplomatically for this, right? There's a lot of countries in the global south that are currently quietly backing Russia that would really raise an eyebrow like this. And to be perfectly frank, Putin doesn't want to give Brazil and India any more excuses to raise any more eyebrows, right? They've got enough. So I think this whole thing is a hoax. It's 99% propaganda. And the purposes of that are so the Zelensky regimes can say, look, Russia's bringing in North Korea. NATO troops should fight directly in uniform in Ukraine. We need the long-range strike capability that you keep denying us with your weapons, i.e. NATO needs to conduct long-range missile strikes in Russia because those North Koreans, they're just behind our missile range, conveniently. But if we had the long-range strikes, we could hit them. And probably they're also hoping to get more support from South Korea. South Korea has already provided hundreds of thousands of artillery shells for the Kiev regime through a quick deal through the U.S., where I don't even know if they were actually in the U.S. in any period before they were sent over. That's actually what was used during the Kiev regime's failed 2003 summer offensive. Those were South Korean artillery shells. So they're probably looking for more South Korean military equipment, more South Korean munitions. That's the whole purpose of this, as far as I can see. Some type of completely hoax escalation. And the Russian government and the North Korean government have both denied this. There's been some coy comments by Putin, basically saying that, well, if we wanted to, if we really wanted to do that, we would have every right to do it, at least in Kursk, right? Or, whatever, considering how many NATO specialist forces and special forces we all know are operating on the ground in Ukraine, as numerous Western politicians have admitted.
Kursk, period. Yeah, I agree with you. There's nothing you said there that I disagree with. I'm with you on all of that. Kursk itself, that was going to be the big one. They're going to go in there, and they're going to show the Ruskies this time. They're going to go to their home turf. They're going to take nuclear power plants. They're going to take nuclear sites with nuclear weapons. Man, this is going to be big. It didn't turn out real well, Mark. It didn't turn out well at all. Talk about now, certainly terrible things have happened. They've killed and kidnapped and raped. I mean, they've done crimes against humanity against Russian civilians, but their overall plan of taking part of Russia and doing all kinds of nuclear related things seems to have come to a screeching halt at the loss of a whole hell of a lot of soldiers. That, in fact, I would argue this. A lot of the things that are falling along the contact line, a big part of why it's going so fast, it would have went anyway, but they used up all of their reserves and just made it all the quicker.
Yeah, not just manpower. Manpower is very important because they pulled manpower away from these already collapsing defensive lines in the south and central Donbass to send to Kursk, right? They made all these claims that.
How much? Did we ever get any real numbers or any figures of how many people actually that were involved in that Kursk operation?
Yeah, from their side, even when it began, there was close to 60,000. Right?
Wow.
Not all of them. Not all of them were actually in Kursk. Mm-hmm. A lot of were behind the lines.
Right.
In the Ukrainian side of the border, but they're an essential part of any military operation. Right. Actually, it's a very small number of troops that actually, generally fight on the front lines. But yeah, there was a big diversion of forces. Some of them were new forced conscripts, but a considerable number of them were experienced troops that were pulled off of Pokrovsk and Toretsk and Chasiv Yar and everywhere else. And they made these claims as if Russia would have to. They said Russia would have to pull troops away from the Donbass, particularly from the Pokrovsk offensive, in order to stop this. And Russia didn't have to do that. Why? Because Russia has enough manpower. They had enough reserves. They were able to pull them out of a few other locations out of the Donbass, but mostly reserves that had not yet been committed to the special military operation in Ukraine. So they didn't need to. And the Kiev regime also lost, perhaps even more importantly, a huge amount of Western equipment that at this point can't be replaced, right? We're talking more. I don't have a final count at hand, but at least 5 HIMARS systems, perhaps more, right? They lost multiple expensive Western Patriot systems, the Iris-T, the German systems. They lost a French air defense system there. They lost, and now Russia has essentially unquestioned air superiority and strike capability pretty much everywhere in Ukraine because the Kiev regime has no air defense left. Essentially, everything that the West sent, most of it is gone. Right. And a considerable portion of it was destroyed in Kursk. But they've also lost large numbers of tanks. They've lost some electronic warfare equipment, APCs. In fact, there's lots of reports about them in the Kursk region now being reduced to using civilian vehicles to get their forces around and to pull them back out as part of medevac and stuff. Because they have no military vehicles left, not even APCs and infantry fighting vehicles. So, yeah, I mean, I hope they enjoyed that very brief and very limited tactical success. They had its big info war celebration across the Western media. Yeah, stick it to the Russians. Putin is humiliated. Well, I hope they got what they needed out of that because humiliation doesn't win wars. And more than 50% of the original Kursk incursion territory has already been taken back by Russia. And even the Western media is admitting now that it has denuded these defensive positions in the Donbass, particularly in the South Donbass, of troops and equipment. And Russia would have, their advances would have been much slower and more difficult if those troops, instead of being out in the open in podunk villages, right, of no strategic value, with no fortifications, no defenses, very small urban areas, if they had been instead in the east, in these tight urban areas, and with built up fortifications, they would have been much more effective. So while there has been an undeniable loss of Russian civilian life in the Kursk region, not huge, but any amount, hundreds we're talking, that is a tragedy. By and large, the Kiev regime has just shot itself, right? It's, you want to say, in the foot, or as Orban put it, shot itself in the lungs with this Kursk incursion. It has cost them badly. It has been a huge strategic blunder of monumental proportions in hindsight. And even the Western mainstream media is very belatingly, very grudgingly admitting this now.
Let me ask you this. That being said, I can't keep up with the daily towns falling.
No,
Not that I can pronounce any of them. Any of them. But Sleboda, I'm pretty good with that. But when you start to get into the words that are like yeah, that's when I get lost, right? But it seems to me that very, very important that this thing is really going south for the or west, as it were, for the Kiev regime, and not the least of which being because of the language that I'm hearing. I heard last week someone in Poland said, we're going to have a modus vivendi with the, after this thing's over with the really the Poles.
Oh, they pulled out the Latin. Out the Latin.
Exactly.
It's desperate.
you guys are like, we eat Russians for lunch, but perhaps maybe now we need to be friends. We're hearing things like that. Gerhard Schroeder is now no longer cast out into the land of evil Russian lovers. There are people in Germany saying perhaps we should let people who have been giving us reasonable advice about how to deal with this, perhaps we should let them back in the circle. Things ain't going so well. That's all I'm trying to say, Mark. What do we know about the contact line? As I said, you can't keep up with the towns that are falling, with the, what do they call them, cauldrons forming. Mark.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the really hot area right now is the South Donbass. After the fall of Ugledar, which was really quickly, the Kiev regime's defenses have collapsed in South Donbass. And you know me, I have never used the word collapse before, right? I've talked about, retreats, withdrawals, defeats, but we're actually seeing the first real collapse of Kiev regime forces. It's still localized to the South Donbass, but they're not even able to slow Russian forces down now. Russian forces are right now, their only real limitation is their own logistics and consolidating territory. So you're right, 3-4 settlements a day, right, are being moved up. Sleboda was taken in final result very quickly. Karahava, another one of these important logistics centers that was once behind the defensive lines, is in operational encirclement right now and is facing potential full encirclement, being physically cut off as well. And everything is tightening further on Pokrovsk. Right now, in the South Donbass, Russia is using 3 armies at the same time, right? You've got the center forces, the south forces, and the east forces, and they're all cooperating together. I remember all these Western analysts like Michael Kaufman at CNAS, who have been saying all along in this conflict that Russia can't operate, with more than a brigade-style offensive at the same time. They're using 3 armies at the same time right now. There's nothing that can stop Russian forces, it appears, in the South Donbass. And I really expect, aside from Pokrovsk everything should be wrapped up by the end of this year in the South Donbass. Pokrovsk will probably be under siege by then. Eventually, it will be taken, and it won't last near as long as Bakhmut or Avdiivka. It will fall very quickly because they don't have the type of built-up defenses there, and with the entire surrounding region, they're just, it's a boa constrictor because they're just cutting off everything all around it. They're moving in, and then by probably next spring, Russian forces will be moving on the last defensive line in the Donbass, which is the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka line. It will be almost assuredly wrapped up or nearly wrapped up by the middle of next year. But more importantly, these forces, once Pokrovsk is taken here in the South Donbass, a good portion of that force is not going to be sent north to deal with that last defensive line. Instead, it's widely discussed they're going to be sent west, because west of Pokrovsk is operational space. Here is the start of the Ukrainian steppe. There's no more hills. There's no more tight urban agglomerations, no more coal mines and slag heaps and fortifications and defensive lines that have characterized this long, grueling war of attrition in the Donbass. It's just flat, open plains with tiny little undefendable settlements all the way to the banks of the Dnieper River, right? So Russia forces are going to cut into the Zaporozhye and Dnieper regions from the west. And there's a lot of talk that Russia may begin in the coming months a new offensive, an offensive of their own coming from the south up into Zaporozhye region as well. So they may be sending troops from the east and from the south at the same time, probably at the start of next year. And you're going to see, I think what we're going to see is Russia is going to start to transition, at least in this area, away from the strategy, tactics of a war of attrition and towards the strategy and tactics of maneuver warfare, simply because they've attrited the Kiev regime's military to the point where that is possible without any real serious losses from the Russian side.
Well, I think a lot of that will be dictated by Russia's industrial shovel capacity, because otherwise they won't have anything to fight with. We understood 3 months into the war, they ran out of missiles, and then they began, of course, I guess they were out of shells, rounds too, so they started fighting with shovels, but that seems to be going well. All right. There's something else I wanted to ask you about that, and that is, okay, we've talked about Kamala's, I've talked about her incoherent babbling, and Trump is, one day he's cooking fries, the next day he's in a garbage truck. I think it's hilarious. I think
American political theater.
Exactly.
It never ceases to be amusing to me the way Americans can get so passionate, insisting that Coke is better than Pepsi or Pepsi is better than Coke. They're so sincere about it, like they believe it actually makes a difference. It's so cute. It's
well, you know, and if you look into that history, that was actually a conspiracy between Coke and Pepsi. They worked together on that because what they wanted to create a dynamic where people said, do you want Coke or Pepsi? Not Shasta, not anything else. So as long as you're choosing between Coke and Pepsi, they went, that, which kind of reminds me of the Uniparty, kind of same dynamic at any rate. Although I think things are interesting. At that Kamala Harris, boy, the interesting creature. But here's my point. Out of all of that, not Trump, he's not gonna go to the Kremlin with a pack of large fries or ask if he can empty their garbage.
You've seen the videos of Trump serving at McDonald's out the drive-through window?
Oh, and it was hilarious.
Have you seen the meme they did in AI where Putin and Kim Jong-un drive up to the drive-thru and get served by Trump.
Oh, I bet
It's
that's
hilarious.
hilarious. I gotta find
Yes, it
that.
is.
I gotta
Yes.
find that. So at any rate, so here we are. The old fry cook is saying that, look, man, I want out. JD Vance is saying, we got to now. That being, certainly, let's just say their plans have a few holes in them. But Biden, we now know, forbid anyone in his administration from talking to Putin or President Putin or Sergei Lavrov. It was like, no, whatever we do, we don't want to talk to the Russians and try to end this thing because, hey, we did say to the last Ukrainian, and there's a few left, right? That seems to be their position. We got a few Ukrainians. We're not quite out of Ukrainians, and we'll keep going till we run out, right? Sadly. But here's my point. Your thoughts, if there is a genuine feeling, and I know at times the Russian leadership can piss off the Russian people because they're like, no, let's smash them. And the Russian leadership can be like, yeah, well, maybe we'll work out a deal that you guys might not quite not. You know where I'm getting at. Your thoughts on Vance and Trump, if they win, wanting a deal, but I don't see how they can do it because the Russians don't need a deal. I put it like this. If my opponent is laying on the ground and I'm pummeling him mercilessly, he needs a deal. I don't. You know what I'm saying? His deal, the only deal I'll take is unconditional surrender. At any rate, I throw all that at you, Mark. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's extremely pertinent. So the Russian government the official position is it doesn't make any difference who wins the election, that the U.S. president has very limited power to actually affect foreign policy and military, that the real decisions are made by, the Ben Rhodes called it the blob, if you want to call it the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, and inevitably U.S. Presidents, as during the previous Trump administration, where he talked a good game about good relations with Russia and then hired a bunch of neocons, Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, to run his foreign policy, and then it was the worst it had been up until that point. So the Russian position is that nothing is going to change. You're right. Russia is winning on the battlefield, and we've seen several of these plans tossed around in the Western media by Trump proxies, and none of these will be acceptable to Russia. And they're essentially they're going to try to award Russia with what they've already gotten and what they've already taken and but not officially. Like yeah, but we'll try to take it back in a few years, right? That's not going to fly. That's not going to fly at all. So Russia is, there will be some type of diplomatic settlement eventually, but I don't think we're anywhere close to there yet, right? As you said,
one quick thing, Trump on Joe Rogan said, "What is your plan?" And Trump said then, I think it was the only time he was honest. He says, "I can't tell you that." He says, "I want to get a deal. I'll get a deal." Trump, "I'll get a deal." He says, "But if I told you, I wouldn't be able to get the deal." And I think that is an indication. Again, we got the blob, we got everything else, but I think there is an indication, if nothing else, out of his narcissism. Trump wants to be the guy that say, nobody could get a deal, but I'm Trump. And I told him, Trump, Trump, he wants a deal because he's Trump. But at any rate, do you think at
he's
some point
actually said that if Putin doesn't accept his deal, that he threatened to flood Ukraine with weapons, and which just makes me laugh. With what weapons? If Biden could find any more weapons that the Kiev regime could use, that he could give him, effectively, he would have already given them. And Trump has at other places admitted the U.S. is out of artillery shells. They're out of air defense interceptor missiles. They're out of key munitions and equipment that the Kiev regime would need even to hold their own in this conflict. So he can't flood them with anything. He's also at other times.
I think that's BS. That's Trump BS and bravado. You know what I mean? You got to.
He's also threatened to bomb Moscow. right? He said the Russian government is not going to take this clown seriously. I'm afraid, right? Maybe he's more serious in person, but they're in the driver's seat. There's no reason for them to accept some deal from the United States simply because Trump got elected, and they should accept some half measure that would see this war refought again in 4 to 5 years. And you're right. I think the Russian people would be furious if there is not a very substantial victory after all of the effort and the blood that has been shed so far. There's this constant refrain: no more Minsk, right? No more Minsk agreements that the West can walk out on that would leave the problem of the Kiev regime in Ukraine unfulfilled. I think that this will not be ended until this regime is rooted out, root and branch from Kiev. Even then, it won't be completely over. But unfortunately, I think that this is going to be probably continued, right? The conflict, obviously, the Western support is going to decrease, whoever is elected. They simply can't provide anymore, right? It's not a matter of political will. It's not a matter of money. U.S. can always print more money. We know that, right? We've seen $36 trillion testimony to that. It's simply the U.S. military industrial complex is not geared up to fight this type of war, and they can't ramp it up fast enough to compete with Russia. So they can continue it at a lower level.
They got 2 wars, not just 1.
Yeah. All right. Supposedly China is more important to them, right? And they want to start a war there. While they believe they can still win it. Yeah, right. Okay.
While the Iranians, they can't touch the Iranians. I mean, right now they're looking, things ain't looking all that good for the U.S. arms race. I'll just say that.
Yes. Yeah. I think there is growing evidence, one, that Iran's strike was much more effective than was initially admitted. And 2, it's starting to look like that Israel's counterstrike was much less effective than was initially propagandized in the Western media. And if you add those 2 things together, we are seeing a major shift in the military balance in the Middle East that is getting very hard to deny now.
One question I do have to ask you, since you're in Moscow, because I got to get your perspective, and that is the discussion about the Iran strike, right? And I want to get your perspective on that. Various discussions. What the one that's starting to prevail is basically the Israelis tried and were thwarted, right? But then that question goes to this: were they thwarted because of the Iranians' technological capabilities, or did the Russians come in with S-400s and all this advanced Russian technology, which we were led to believe was only shovels? But whatever it is, it's either the Iranians are technically, really technologically have become pretty advanced, right? Which they don't want to admit that. They'll at least try to say, no, the Russians came in with all kinds of S-400 and stuff. And that's the reason that the F-35s and all couldn't come in. Is there some truth to a little bit of all of that? Anyway, Mark, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it really ends up somewhere in the middle. First of all, Iran's military has been dramatically underestimated by Israel in the West, much like Russia's military was, by the way. And I don't think anyone has a question that the Russian military is a scale up above the Iranian military, right?
Order of magnitude.
Order of magnitude, right? Yeah. I wouldn't scoff at Iran's indigenous air defense systems, right? They've learned over time. Russia already years ago provided them with the S-300 system, which was integrated, and they learned a lot from that to help develop their own indigenous air defense systems. There's a lot of talk that in the Western media that Russia, in the last 2 months has provided Iran with S-400 air defense systems, perhaps with other shorter range, but actually probably even more important air defense systems like the Pantsir, like the Tor system, very, very advanced short, medium range Russian air defense systems that operate as part of an integrated air defense network. There's also talk that Russia provided them with a very powerful, Russia's probably most powerful electronic warfare complex, the Murmansk BN, which plays a very important, can play a very heavy role in air defense, actually, right? It's a shield in the electromagnetic spectrum that can cut off GPS signals, that can cut off communications between planes, between missiles. Really powerful system. Russia and Iran, for what it's said, both deny that, right? But they would. So we don't know. I suspect that Russia probably did assist them, even if it was only with satellite intelligence, right? C4ISR, Russia's powerful radars in the south would have, and Russia has radars in Syria, by the way, right?
Right.
At the Hmeimim Air Base,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, they could have provided them with a lot of information that could have helped them formulate a defense, just intelligence wise, right? Even in the Ukraine conflict, it's often underestimated how much value providing all that satellite information to the Kiev regime in Ukraine has been to them being able to hold out in the conflict as long as they have. Intelligence, satellite information, radar, these are all very important things in modern warfare. So by and large, I think that Russia probably provided the icing on the cake to the Iranian defense. They might have helped, cover it over, help tie it together, but I would not. I think there has been a general underestimation of how effective the Iranian air defense system has been on its own, which is not to say that they took down everything from Israel out of the sky or anything like that, but that they performed much better in relative terms than the West expected.
And of course, Israel, what we have now is Israel. And to me, it's this is this to me were proxy aerial attacks, right? The US did everything, brought in, pulled out every stop they could to stop the Iranian attack on Israel, to no avail. It's now clear if the Iranians, they can hit Israel anytime they want to, right? And it certainly, in listening and following a number of people who I have a lot of respect for, such as Alistair Crook, it certainly appears as though we're going to do the usual. We've heard it all along. You go in, you suppress the air defense, then you come in with other waves and you attack various targets. According to Alistair Crook and others, they came in and the first attack in the old air defense systems didn't work, and they had to call off the rest, that there were F-35s, et cetera, that were locked on, that basically...
I've heard that as well.
Yeah, anyway, do you think there's any... Do you give any credibility to those kinds of discussions, or do you even know?
Okay, so Alistair Crook is to be taken seriously whenever he speaks about something, right? I mean, he's been an ambassador. He knows people on both sides. He speaks the local languages. He's very knowledgeable and formidable. I can't say that, what he's saying is 100% correct, but it does make a great deal of sense, right? We know that they cannot have performed any type of effective seed or suppression of enemy air defense operations because there were no Israeli airplanes that even penetrated Iranian airspace. And right, these type of radar homing missiles that are used to take out air defense systems, they're just not long range, right? You have to get in close. I mean, that's the whole lessons of the Vietnam War and the wild weasels and everything. These things are very complicated. This is why Russia's Air Force was had a very limited role for the first 2 years of the conflict in Ukraine, because they had to eliminate the Kiev regime's very effective integrated Soviet legacy air defense system from afar with long-range strike over a year and a half to 2 years. right? And only now does Russia have, and then the Western air defenses had to be eliminated as well. So I think this is very credible without, saying that it is absolutely true. And what these two conflicts have now exposed that should be glaringly obvious, both from the failures in Ukraine and the recent failures to provide effective air defense system in Israel, is that air defense is the US military and the Western military's Achilles heel. It's very poor in relation to what Russia have and what presumably China has, and even right, we can now start to talk about Iranian air defense, however much help they got or didn't have. And if the US can't provide air defense for their allies or for their own forces, how do they think they're going to take on China in the Taiwan Straits and off the South China Sea at the absolutely ridiculously minuscule amount of air defense interceptor missiles, Patriots, THAADs, Aegis ashore, or Aegis afloat that they are making a year? The U.S. military industrial complex, RAND Corporation, just put out a major screaming alarm report. The U.S. military industrial complex is not up to the task. And what they effectively said is that it needs to become a national unity and focused military industrial complex like the Russians have. That's effectively what RAND said. And they're screaming that it was necessary to start doing this yesterday, right? And one of the biggest concerns is air defense interceptor missiles. And it must be said, air defense systems as a whole. And the U.S. did not concentrate on this all through the end of the Cold War and the last 30 years because they believed they would always have air superiority over any given conflict. Russia, and to a lesser extent, China and Iran, recognizing the West's focus on air power and projection, they focused on effective counters to that, which is the air defense and the electronic warfare, which is now today why Russia has the best air defense and electronic warfare in the world. And the U.S. is really hurting. And their strategy in that regard of what to develop and what not now looks like a big decades-long mistake for not properly investing in air defense like the Russians did.
Yeah, the last part of it is this. And their strategy now won't work. Okay, we need to make fill in the blank, right? We need to change things so we can make missiles, whatever the case may be. There's foundational things you need. You got to have steel mills. You know what I mean? I mean, there's certain things you got to make gunpowder. We ain't making much gunpowder these days. You know what I mean?
Even the type of cotton that they use in artillery shells,
Gun
the
cotton.
biggest source of it in the world is in the Uyghur region of China, which the U.S. has leveled sanctions on as part of their genocide hoax for propaganda reasons against China. Way to shoot yourself in the foot again.
Yeah, they don't. So we don't. Here's my point. Comes out over and over again. Neoliberalism has hollowed out the industrial capacity of the West completely, and ultimately, war making comes down to industrial capacity, and we don't have it, and we have a system that not only has killed it, but makes sure it's not coming back, and it can't come back. So they're saying we should do something that we can't do. You know, Garland, you should practice 100-yard sprints every day. I got a bad back. I can't sprint, I can't sprint 100 centimeters. Yeah, if you would just do 100-yard sprints, you'd be great. Yeah, that's not going to happen. I don't have the foundational things that I need in my back, like pads between the vertebrae to make that happen. So we don't have the foundation, the commodity, the economic. Might I add this? You got to have people who are trained. You got to have an educated workforce, and their educational system is shot.
It's all the STEM graduates in U.S. schools. They're all immigrants from India and previously from China and everywhere else. Seriously, go to any STEM, program in any major university in the U.S. Most of the students and 70-80% of the teachers are all foreigners.
It's interesting that Trump, the two jobs that Trump was doing recently was a fry cook and a garbage man. Those are the only jobs left in the United States. You can cook fries or you can deliver garbage or something like that. Other than that, there ain't a whole lot for you to do. Mark
Spin Master. You forgot Spin Master. There's plenty of room for that yet.
That's a big one. Mark, where can people find you online?
You can find me on Twitter, X, at Mark Sleboda 1. But follow me on Substack and Telegram at The Real Politic with Mark Sleboda.
All right. And everyone, don't forget, follow me also at Rockfin and follow me on Rumble, because as you know, as Mark knows all too well, we can wake up on any given day and YouTube can throw us off. If that happens, hopefully it won't, but make sure that you're subscribed to those other places. Mark, hope to get you back next week. I imagine we'll have one or two things to talk about.
I imagine so. Look forward to it.
Something's happening Tuesday. I can't remember what it is. I think some guy's going to be cooking fries and delivering garbage on Tuesday.
Political theater.
All right. Talk to you soon. All right, everybody. We're out.